Hello and welcome to ABN's Jihad Watch program. I am Robert Spencer, and in previous shows, if you have been watching, we have been interviewing various Muslim leaders, various clerics. We have had discussions about the freedom of speech and the Islamic war on the freedom of speech and so on. I thought that now, for the next few episodes of this program, which is now going weekly, it would be useful to step back and to examine the book that is really at the center of so many global conflicts today. And that book, of course, is the Quran, the holy book of Islam. Many people speak about it. Many people feel very passionately about it. Very few people, correspondingly, actually know anything about what it says. And too many rely on what other people tell them that it says and make even public policy based on the descriptions of the Quran and the understandings of the Quran that they get from these people. I think that in light of the global situation, in light of the fact that there are indeed in countries stretching from Indonesia all across Central Asia and into Africa, as well as in Europe and in the Americas, there are armed groups of people and also peaceful groups of people who believe in the Quran as the Word of God, and not only believe in it as a religious imperative, but believe in it as something that is a guidepost, a guidebook for political action, that it is very necessary for people in the West, people in the United States, to read the book, to know exactly what's in it for themselves. But this is actually not as easy as it may seem at first glance. The Quran is actually one of the hardest books in the world to read, one of the least accessible, one of the most difficult to understand immediately when one reads it. And so I thought that it would be helpful to people who are interested in defending freedom in the United States and around the world to go make a series of programs that involve an extensive investigation of the contents of the Quran, not, mind you, as a substitute for reading the Quran, not at all, but as an additional aid to reading it so that one may understand what one is reading. Now, there are a number of pitfalls that we should try to get out of the way in the early going. One of them is that we're going to be discussing the Quran in English. Now, of course, many of the viewers of ABN, if not most, are Arabic speakers, native Arabic speakers who can very well read the Quran in the original language and don't need an English language discussion of it. At the same time, it is to Americans in many cases in the United States that you will be discussing the Quran, and you will need to be able to do that in English. At the same time, of course, the Quran affects not only Arabic speakers, but in the world today, it is speakers of all languages who are coming up against Quranic imperatives, who are finding themselves confronted by people who believe in the Quran and believe that it is a guidebook for not only religious action, but political action that does infringe upon the vision of society that has prevailed in the Western world up to now. Now, this being the case, it is, in the first place, I think, very important for us to have a discussion of the Quran in English and to try to enable English-speaking readers to understand what it is they're dealing with in the Quran and in believers in the Quran. And then, also to be able to answer some of the very common objections that Islamic apologists make when non-Muslims begin to speak about the Quran. And so the first one, of course, revolves around the language itself. And probably anyone who has ever dealt with Muslim Brotherhood groups, with their spokesman in the United States, with anybody who has been involved with issues regarding Islam and jihad terrorism in the United States, or really anywhere in the Western world, will be confronted by Islamic supremacist spokesmen saying, well, you know, you can't really understand the Quran unless it's in Arabic. And this is something that I get all the time when I quote the Quran in English, that you have to understand the Quran in Arabic, read the Quran in Arabic, or you're not really reading the Quran. Now, the funny thing about this is that recently I said, okay, well then let's talk about it in Arabic, and gave the Arabic verse with a discussion of it, and that of course was waved away as well. And so it's important to remember that when this is said, it is not really offered as a point of discussion or of thought. It is a tactic intended to end discussion and thought. And it is not really something that is offered by somebody who is a person of goodwill, who is interested in a rational discussion. Because the more you look at it, the more absurd it becomes. If you think about it, Arabic is a human language. There are people who speak Arabic and who speak English. There are people who are fluent in Arabic and fluent in other languages. And they are able to take their concepts and thoughts that they are thinking in Arabic and express them in another language. Now, of course, everyone who has ever translated any kind of document knows that there's always some slippage between one language and another. But in the main, it is not only possible, but it is not even all that difficult to render the meaning of a phrase in one language in another, and Arabic is included. Now, of course, the meaning is the key word in that phrase, because many Arabic speakers will tell you, and believing Muslims will tell you, of course it's a point of Islamic doctrine, that the Quran doesn't exist except in Arabic, that it cannot be translated. And this is why translations of the Quran generally tend to bear titles such as the meaning of the glorious Quran, the Quran interpreted, and so on, not just the Quran. It would be an expression of impiety for a Muslim to translate the Quran from Arabic into English or any other language and then say, this is the Quran itself. It would be an act of impiety because the Quran itself says that it's in Arabic, and many times repeats that it's in Arabic. It's very important to the author or authors of the Quran to impress upon the readers that it is in Arabic. But the meaning can be conveyed, and so the translators do say that they are expressing the meaning of the Quran. But the music of the Arabic, the sound of the Arabic, the rhyme scheme, the hypnotic effect that it has over the people who hear it recited properly, these things are considered in Islamic theology to be an essential part of the meaning of the essence, the substance of the Quran. And so they would say that it cannot be translated. But that is not the same thing as the implication that people are really making when they say, well, you can't really understand the Quran unless it's in Arabic. Because what they're really saying in that case is that the meaning cannot be rendered into English or any other language. What they're really saying is that you cannot possibly understand this book in any other language except Arabic. Now that is an absurd claim. But that is exactly the claim that they are trying to make, particularly when non-Muslims quote uncomfortable portions of the Quran, like the celebrated verse of the sword, Surah 9:5, which is, it includes the passage, slay the unbelievers wherever you find them, which also occurs at other points in the Quran, including chapter 2, verse 191, chapter 4, verse 89. That is a verse, chapter 9:5, slay the unbelievers wherever you find them, for which Osama bin Laden actually praised Allah in one of his communiques. And it is one that is obviously, for obvious reasons, very powerful and important for jihadi groups. But many people will say that the understanding of it cannot possibly be rendered, the true understanding of it, cannot possibly be rendered in any other language. And when they're confronted with it, they'll come back to this. You have to know the Arabic. You have to be able to speak Arabic. Well, look, there are numerous Muslim translations of the Quran. That is, translations made by pious Muslims for pious Muslims. And this is because of the plain and simple fact that although the Quran is essentially in Arabic, and although Islamic theology holds that it is in its essence in Arabic, such that a translation of the Quran is not and cannot be the Quran itself, nonetheless, most Muslims in the world today don't speak Arabic. Even fewer of them speak 7th century classical Arabic in which the Quran is actually written. Most of the Muslims in the world today are not living in Arabic countries and are not Arabs. The largest, most populous Muslim country in the world is Indonesia. The second is Pakistan. India has a larger Muslim population than the population of Pakistan, but of course India has an even larger Hindu population. None of those are Arabic countries. Iran, Afghanistan, not Arabic countries. And so most of the Muslims, when they recite the Quran, when they go to the mosque and they are saying their prayers and they come to a point where they have to recite a portion of the Quran, they recite it in Arabic. They recite it in Arabic because they have to. It's not, in its essence, the Quran unless they recite it in Arabic. But unless they have studied a translation, they do not understand what they are reciting. They are reciting syllables that they have learned by rote. And as a matter of fact, the madrasas in Pakistan are celebrated for teaching young Muslims to memorize all or at least part of the Quran at a very early age. And that is the strong, strident emphasis of the curricula in such schools. But that means that these young children in Pakistan who are not native speakers of Arabic and probably don't know any Arabic at all are memorizing syllables by rote that they do not understand, such that a Pakistani Muslim once told me in all seriousness, "I am very proud of my religion and I have memorized almost all of the Quran. And one day I intend to get one of those translations and find out what it means." Now that sounds like a joke. It doesn't sound like he could possibly have been serious, but he was. He was serious because he didn't know Arabic. He didn't know what he was reciting. He had learned Arabic by rote, the Arabic of the Quran, in order to be able to say his prayers properly. But he didn't understand them. Now, there are many Muslims. There is an entire industry of Muslim scholars around the world that are dedicated to supplying this need and to rendering the Quran in other languages in order to make it understandable not primarily to non-Muslims, but to Muslims, so that they will be able to understand their religion and understand what they are reciting when they say their prayers. Now, there are also translations of the Quran, to be sure, that are created for non-Muslims and generally contain commentary that tries to smooth over the uncomfortable passages of the Quran that are difficult for Muslims to justify in the modern world. But it is undeniable that there are Muslim translations that are made for Muslims and that are intended to aid Muslims in understanding the Quran. And so what are we to make of the claim that you can't understand the Quran unless it's in Arabic, in light of the fact that the Quran has now been rendered by Muslims into essentially every language in the world, either for the purposes of dawah, proselytizing, or for the purposes of aiding Muslims in understanding their holy book? How are we to understand this? We are either faced with the proposition that none of these translations are worth anything and that none of them will give the true meaning of the Quran to somebody who does not speak Arabic or doesn't speak Arabic well, or we have to grant the possibility that these translations are perfectly reliable and that they do give a picture of the Quran that non-Muslims can take and use in order to understand Islam properly. Now that, of course, is the difficulty that Muslims get themselves in when they make this claim, but they are not very often called out upon it because nobody thinks it through. But the reality is that if a non-Muslim is using a translation of the Quran made by Muslims for Muslims, like this one, then there is no reason why he shouldn't be able to get what the Quran is saying, except for the fact that the Quran itself is not all that clear about what it's saying many times. Now that may seem strange on the face of it, because this is, after all, what is supposed to be a revelation from the Supreme God that enables people to be guided to the so-called straight path or the right path, the path that leads to salvation and to living in paradise forever. So how is it that a book that is supposed to make the world clear and express what has not been known be difficult to understand? It doesn't make any sense. Nonetheless, this is the case. The Quran, in many cases, is like walking up to two people whom you do not know, and they are talking about events in which you were not involved, and they do not stop to explain it to you, and you're just stuck trying to figure out what's going on. This is because the Quran many times refers to events in a way that makes it clear that the author or authors understand that the people reading or hearing the Quran recited will know what's being referred to, but we generally don't. There is, therefore, a great need for understanding what it is that made the Quran be the way it is. How is it that these things are being said? What are the circumstances of these revelations? Why are they being made? And that brings us to the second point that Muslim apologists will use when they are trying to get out of a situation in which a non-Muslim is quoting to them passages of the Quran that they would rather not address. And that is that they will say, you're taking this out of context. Not only do you not know Arabic, not only can you not really understand the Quran unless it's in Arabic, but also this is exactly what happens when you try to read the Quran without aid. You take it all out of context. Now there is a way that the Quran can be taken out of context. There is a way that any book, passages in any book, can be taken out of context. For example, there is a parable that Jesus tells in the New Testament in which he speaks about the final judgment, and he says that the king orders that his enemies be brought and slain before him. Now, many Islamic apologists will point to that and say, see, you talk about violent passages in the Quran, you talk about violence within Islam, but you have to confront violence in your own holy book. And the New Testament, the supposed book of peace, the book of the peaceful, Jesus Christ, contains this passage where he is ordering people to come and slay his enemies before him. Now, that is an example of taking a passage out of context, because the passage in the first place is a parable. It is not a literal recording of events or an instruction that Jesus gives to his apostles. It is a story in which the king stands for God, and it is clear that he is referring to the final judgment, when everyone will stand before the awesome judgment seat of Christ and have his deeds examined and be judged by God. Now, obviously, there has never been a Christian group or a group of Christian theologians or any sect of Christianity or any understanding of Christianity that said that Christians should go out and kill those who do not believe in Christ on the basis of this passage. There have been Christians who have killed in the name of Christianity. There have been Christians who have done great evils in the name of Christianity, and that cannot be denied. But they have had no justification in the Scriptures, either the Old Testament or the New Testament, for this behavior. And this is an attempt by Islamic apologists to find passages that would justify this. And they say that they can find some in the Old Testament, and we will discuss that at a later time. But in any case, this use of this bring my enemies and slay them before me is clearly an example of something that's taken out of context. And so is slay the unbelievers wherever you find them, when non-Muslims quote that today to Muslims, is that also taking something out of context and making an unjustified use of the Islamic scripture in order to claim falsely that terrorism actually has some root within Islamic teaching itself? In order to answer that question properly, we have to look at the context of the passage and the context in which it was revealed. The problem is that while there is a context to that passage, and it contains several indications of the circumstances in which one might slay the unbelievers wherever one finds them, there is actually very little context in terms of the circumstances of the revelation given in the passage or anywhere else in the Quran. And this is one of the funny things about the Quran, that Muslims constantly claim or complain that non-Muslims are taking it out of context, but it actually has remarkably little context in the first place. The Quran is not like the Bible in that sense. The Bible, Old Testament, is full of historical books in which the circumstances of various events are abundantly explained. The New Testament, the four Gospels, are roughly chronological, historical accounts of the life of Jesus. The Quran, however, moves from topic to topic, often within the same chapter or surah, moves from topic to topic without chronological arrangement, without any clear logical coherence. And it also is not arranged in any chronological or clearly logical form. And so, when Muslims complain about context, the first answer is, what context? The Quran is a series of relatively disconnected narratives. Some of them have a chronological unity within themselves, but there is no overarching, unifying structure to the book. The chapters are arranged roughly, but not consistently, from the longest to the shortest, such that the longest chapter is the second, after the Fatiha, which is the most common prayer of Islam, a very brief prayer, 7 verses, in the first chapter of the Quran. Then the longest chapter is the second, and on through to the 114th being very, very brief. But there's nothing that actually makes it even more difficult to read for somebody who's just picking it up, because it isn't as if the second chapter tells the first part of the story and then the third chapter picks up the story from there and the fourth from there and so on. It's just the arrangement is solely based on, or primarily based on, the length of the chapters. And so it flits from subject to subject without any clear unity. For context, one has to go to the Hadith. The Hadith are the traditions of Muhammad's words and deeds that were actually compiled a couple of centuries after the Quran is supposed to have been written, and certainly at least a century after it began to circulate widely in the Islamic world. Now, the Hadith are multi-volumes. I have 30 volumes of it in my office, and I don't have remotely all of it. But the Hadith are numerous stories of circumstances in the life of Muhammad in which he gained some revelation, in which Allah supposedly spoke to him and told him the answer to a question that he was wondering about, or that was being disputed among the Muslims, or arose in the context of a battle or some other circumstance. Or Allah is telling Muhammad in the Quran various things about a battle that is just completed or something that just happened, and while the details of the event are not filled in the Quran, they're filled in the Hadith. Now, it is very difficult for a non-Muslim Westerner even to get hold of volumes of the Hadith, and then difficult to navigate them because their arrangement is by subject matter and not by a chronological understanding of the Quran or of the events of Muhammad's life at all. And so it is extremely difficult just to pick up the Quran and know what's going on. Now, I have written a book, The Complete Infidel's Guide to the Quran, which is intended to be a basic and general introduction to the Quran that looks at the Hadith, that looks at the circumstances of these revelations according to Islamic tradition, and explains them on that basis. Explains, that is, the understanding that the mainstream Muslim will have of them. And while there are many other guides available, and obviously it is not imperative that you read my guide, it is imperative, I would say, that you read some guide to the Quran, and that you be aware that Hamas-linked Muslim Brotherhood front groups in the United States, like the Council on American Islamic Relations, the Islamic Society of North America, the Muslim American Society, and so on, have distributed Qurans with commentary or with explanations or guides that are severely misleading and are designed to foster ignorance and complacency in Americans in particular, so that they don't know what the agenda is of the Islamic world as based on the Quran. And so it is very important to be able to understand the Quran in context, and very important to get a guide, very important to get a good guide. And what I hope to do over the next few episodes of this Jihad Watch program on ABN is to give some idea of what the Quran is all about and what it is intended to do for Muslims, and why it is that when, for example, American troops burn the Quran, even Qurans that are being used, being written in the margins in order to be passed to somebody else to carry out a jihad plot, even when Qurans like that are burned, Muslims are outraged and begin to riot and to murder innocent people and so on. Why it is that the burning of a copy of a book of which billions, literally billions of copies exist, why that sets off murderous rages and rampages around the world. Why it is that the United States government is so reverent toward the Quran that it has instructed jailers at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba who are guarding the imprisoned Al-Qaeda and Taliban operatives. It has instructed them to treat the Quran with immense reverence. Non-Muslims are forbidden to touch the Arabic Quran, and so in Guantanamo, the prison guards actually have to wear gloves. And it is forbidden for the Quran to be put on the ground, and so they actually have made little hammocks for the Quran, so that instead of resting on the ground in these prisoners' prison cells, it is cradled up off the ground. And it is extremely odd that these regulations are in place in light of the fact that the Quran itself is what got those people into prison. It is the Quran itself and its imperatives about waging war against unbelievers that led those people to take up arms and to try to kill Americans and got them captured and put in Guantanamo. And so the very book that contains the motivating forces that led these men to take up arms against United States troops and to plot jihad terror attacks against Americans is what is being treated with this reverence. It's extremely strange. And this cognitive dissonance continues on all levels. For example, recently in the news, we have heard a lot about the Fort Hood jihad mass murderer, Major Nidal Malik Hassan. Now, Major Nidal Malik Hassan was an army psychiatrist who, motivated by the teachings of the Quran and the teachings of Islam, as he himself made abundantly clear in explanations that he distributed and published himself among his fellow workers in army psychiatry, he understood that it was his imperative to wage war against unbelievers, and that the unbelievers included Americans, even though he was in the U.S. Army. Ultimately, he took up a gun and he murdered 13 Americans at Fort Hood in Texas. And he is now on trial before a military court. The trial has turned into something of a farce because Major Hassan has grown a beard. A beard is contrary to Army regulations. But Major Hassan says that he doesn't care about Army regulations. It is a religious imperative for him to wear a beard, and so he's grown this beard. The trial cannot go on with Major Hassan in open defiance of Army regulations. And so finally, the prosecutors won the permission to have him forcibly shaved. As in the Army, if you are in disobedience of regulations and you are an Army officer, then the Army is within its rights, as has been made abundantly clear, to force compliance. But now the defendant, the defense attorneys have filed suit to prevent the beard from being shaved. Now, it is important to remember that Major Hassan murdered 13 Americans because of the texts and the teachings of Islam that have now led him to grow a beard. And so the United States military is putting itself into the position of sanctioning the very ideology that led to mass murder by allowing this man, or even allowing this man to tie up the court's time with all these appeals and delays, to grow this beard and even to consider the possibility that the trial should go on while he is in defiance of regulations. This is absurd. But the absurdity comes from the American authorities' ignorance of what is taught in the Quran, their unwillingness to face the fact that Major Hassan's murders were carried out in fulfillment of commands of the Quran and of Islamic teaching in general. And because they are unable or unwilling to face the implications of that, they get into these strange situations where they are treating with respect and reverence this ideology that is the very reason why this man is on trial in the first place. So we're going to take a brief break, and we'll be right back after this with more on the Quran. I'm Robert Spencer. Hello and welcome back. I am Robert Spencer, and this is ABN's Jihad Watch program. I have started a new series on this show that is an introduction to the Quran. We're going to be going through what the Quran says, how it says it, what its significance is, and how mainstream Muslims understand it. We're going to be looking at a variety of topics, including the Quran's teachings about warfare, the Quran's teachings about women, the Quran's teachings about Christians, the Quran's teachings about Jews, the Quran's teachings about a wide variety of other matters, and showing how this may be the one book that is the key to the understanding properly the geopolitical conflicts that are roiling the world increasingly today and are going to continue to do so for a long time to come. Now, before the break, I was discussing the cognitive dissonance regarding the Quran, that so many people seem to read it and understand it in such wildly different ways. And it is indeed important for non-Muslims to read and understand the Quran. But noteworthy at the same time that Islamic advocacy groups like the Hamas-linked Council on American Islamic Relations actually counsel people to read the Quran, and they want people to read the Quran too. Now, it's a very strange thing if you think about it. I want people to read the Quran so that they will understand what it is that non-Muslims are facing around the world today, what it is we're up against, what are the motives and goals of those who are intending to subvert Western society and Judeo-Christian civilization and to establish Islamic law in its place. But the Council on American Islamic Relations, of course, wants people to read the Quran so that they will understand that it's a book of peace. Recently they launched a program called Explore the Quran, and are giving out free Qurans to anyone who asks. And they explained this campaign, Explore the Quran, serves as a response to those who would defame and desecrate the holy book of Muslims without full knowledge of its teachings. False and uninformed accusations have been leveled against the Quran for some time. But now, this initiative places the sacred text directly in the hands of people of other faiths in the American public and encourages people of conscience to discover the truth about Islam. Explore the Quran allows the holy book to speak for itself and to educate people of other faith traditions about the universal teachings of Islam. Now, I'm all for people of conscience discovering the truth about Islam. And I think it's noteworthy that while the Council on American Islamic Relations is saying that if you just read the Quran, you will see that it's a book of peace and a religion of peace, at the same time, there are Muslims in the world today who are rather like Mohammad Reza Tahiri Azhar. Mohammad Reza Tahiri Azhar was a 22-year-old Iranian student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In March 2006, he rented an SUV and he drove it onto campus. And he actually drove it to the center of the campus, the place where students gather in the largest numbers. And he began trying to run them over. And he was not able to kill anyone, but he did hit 9 students and injure them. Now, what is most noteworthy about this attack by Mohammad Reza Tahiri Azhar is a series of 6 letters that he wrote afterward to the Daily Tar Heel, the student newspaper at the University of North Carolina. And in those letters, he explained in immense detail, with copious citations, why he had done what he had done. And he explained that he thought, as a Muslim, on reading the Quran on his own, he wasn't a member of Al-Qaeda, he wasn't a member of any other jihad terror group, he wasn't going to some kind of meetings that taught him to understand the Quran in a particular way. He was just reading it as a believer. And he gave numerous citations that he took to be telling him, as a Muslim, that it was his responsibility to wage war against unbelievers, to kill unbelievers under certain circumstances, and that he had rented the SUV and tried to run over students in obedience to these commands. He explained in one of these letters, he said, "I live with the Holy Quran as my constitution for right and wrong and definition of justice. Allah gives permission in the Quran for the followers of Allah to attack those who have waged war against them." That's what he said, waged war against them, with the expectation of eternal paradise in case of martyrdom, and or living one's life in obedience of all of Allah's commandments found throughout the Quran's 114 chapters. I've read all 114 chapters approximately 15 times since June of 2003, when I started reading the Quran. I live only to serve Allah by obeying all of Allah's commandments of which I am aware, by reading and learning the contents of the Quran. Now, this is very strange. How are we to understand these two different impressions of the Quran? And it is not just the Council on American Islamic Relations that tells us that the Quran is a book of peace. The prominent conservative writer, Michael Potemra, deputy managing editor of National Review magazine, has actually written, "The Quran is one of the loveliest books ever written, a distillation of monotheism that is full of spiritual wisdom, and I never fail to profit from my reading of it." In contrast, Baytullah Masood, who is a Pakistani jihad leader, he claims that Allah and he says this, Allah on 480 occasions in the Holy Quran exhorts Muslims to wage jihad. We only fulfill Allah's orders. Only jihad can bring peace to the world. We will continue our struggle until foreign troops are thrown out. Then we will attack them in the US and Britain until they either accept Islam or agree to pay jizya. The jizya is a tax that the Quran in chapter 9 verse 29 specifies must be levied on Jews, Christians, and some other non-Muslim faiths as a sign of their subjugation under the Islamic social order. Now, it's strange that one man can read the book and say, this is one of the most beautiful books I've ever read. This is a book full of spiritual wisdom. And the other can say, there are 480 exhortations to warfare in it, and we intend to keep fighting until we subjugate the non-Muslims and make them pay this special tax. And yet it's all the same book. And so this only shows the imperative of understanding the Quran ourselves and exploring it in depth ourselves. It is hard to imagine that these two different groups, CARE on the one hand and people like Mohammad Reza Tahiri Azhar on the other, are even reading the same book. And in many cases, it may be that while they are reading the same book, they are concentrating on different passages, on different sections of it. But that is something we will explore as well. It is nonetheless imperative for Americans to read the Quran and to discover why it is that it gives such wildly different impressions to so many different people, but above all, why it is that people who do violence, people who wish not only to kill Americans and other Westerners who wish to kill or to subjugate non-Muslims, why it is that they are the ones who appear to be foremost in the world and intend foremost in the world in their devotion to the Quran and in their reverence for it. And why it is that those who revere it and respect it the most are willing to kill innocent people in order, in their view somehow, to uphold its honor. Even more important, a huge number of policy decisions are predicated upon the assumption that the Quran teaches peace, and that those who brandish Qurans and commit violence are misunderstanding their own religion and perverting the teachings of their holy book. This includes U.S. government postures toward Pakistan, toward Arab Spring, Egypt, and North Africa in general. It also includes immigration matters, airport security procedures, military strategies in Afghanistan, domestic anti-terror policies, and our acquiescence to Saudi Arabia's relentless and extensive Islamic proselytizing campaign in the United States and elsewhere. Our assumptions about Islam being a religion of peace and the Quran being a book of peace are ultimately what was behind the Obama administration's cover-up of the Benghazi attacks. When Ambassador Chris Stevens and 3 other personnel at the U.S. consulate in Benghazi in Libya were attacked and tortured and murdered, the Obama administration was notified within minutes, as it now turns out, that this was a jihad attack by a group calling itself the Ansar as-Sunnah, or that is those who are the exponents of the Sunnah, the correct teaching of Islam, those who are the servants of the true teachings of Islam. And yet the Obama administration lied about this, covered it up, claimed that the attack was all about a video about Muhammad's life that Muslims found offensive, and so on. What was at stake was their core assumption, their core policy assumption, that the Quran is a book of peace and that Islam is a religion of peace. They could not admit that they had given U.S. military aid to the rebels in Libya, and that the rebels in Libya were made up into a great degree of people who, motivated by the teachings of the Quran and Islam, were interested only in waging war against non-Muslims. They couldn't admit that they had aided people essentially who were enemies of the United States and would always be enemies of the United States, because they were not enemies of the United States based on their opposition to various foreign policies of the United States. They're enemies of the United States based on their understanding of their religious imperatives arising from the Quran. The Obama administration could not admit that. It would have made their entire foreign policy a sham and left it in a shambles. And that is exactly the situation that we're in. That is what it is. But this is why they covered it up, because they cannot possibly admit something that will show that their core assumptions about Islam and the Quran are false. And we're going to show that they're false. Not just because of Obama, not just because of current United States policy, but because so much of policy in the United States and in Europe is based on these assumptions about Islam and the Quran that coincide with the statements of Michael Patemra and the statements of the Council on American Islamic Relations. And yet, people around the world continue to quote the Quran to justify hatred and violence. It's imperative we get to the bottom of this. Just days ago, Muqtada as-Sadr, the Iraqi Shiite leader, he objected to the restoration of diplomatic relations between Egypt and Israel, that is the reopening of the Egyptian embassy in Israel and the sending back of an Egyptian ambassador to Israel. And one of the things that he said in objecting to this was that the Jews are the most hostile to those who believe the text of the Quran. And thus, the Egyptians, he was saying, should not have an embassy in Israel, because the Jews are the enemies of the Muslims. Now, where did he get this idea? He got it from the Quran. He got it from chapter 5, verse 82 of the Quran, which says that the Jews are the most hostile, the nearest in enmity to those who believe. This is the prism through which a huge number of Muslims understand the teachings of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They understand it not as a matter of land and a dispute over land, that if the Israelis would just make a certain series of concessions, then everything would be okay. They don't understand it that way at all. They understand this as a religious war that is based on the teachings of the Quran, and that it is impossible to make a lasting peace, to negotiate a lasting peace with Israel, because the Jews are the worst enemies of the Muslims, as the Quran directs. Muqtada as-Sadr was only explaining that, only going by a very obvious teaching of the Quran. But most government and media analysts will not even question, they don't even dare to question the assumption, their core assumption, that the Quran teaches peace, because they believe that any insinuation to the contrary is bigoted, racist, and effectively brands all Muslims as terrorists. In other words, they think that the implication of the possibility that the Quran teaches warfare against unbelievers are too terrible even to contemplate. That it's too horrible to be true, therefore it must not be true. Or only hateful people say it, therefore it must not be true. And of course, there's a concerted effort by groups like the Hamas-linked Council on American Islamic Relations to portray those who do say it, who have read the Quran and do talk about what it really teaches as hateful and bigoted and racist. But this is a tactic designed to deflect attention away from the reality of what is really in the book. But the fact remains that many policymakers at the highest level simply assume the Quran teaches peace without bothering to study the text, an act which might raise some uncomfortable questions. Questions we're going to raise in this series. Others don't read the Quran because they believe that its contents simply don't matter. 14 centuries have passed since it was written, after all, and so they say the world has changed, surely Islam has changed, and besides, anyone can see whatever he wants in a sacred text, can't they? That's why CARE says one thing about the book, while Mohammad Reza Tahiri Azar says something so very different. But actually, no. In the contents of the Quran matter because contrary to what many would have us believe, sacred texts are not entirely determined by what the faithful wish to see in them. Islam cannot be made over into whatever Muslim faithful may want it to be. There may be Muslims who ignore what the Quran says. There may be Muslims who deny what the Quran says. There may be Muslims who do not even know what the Quran says, but still identify themselves as Muslims. But the Quran says what it says, and there is no denying the fact that there are Muslims around the world who are seeing it as a blueprint and as an exhortation to violence and supremacism. The fashionable philosophy of deconstructionism teaches that written words don't have any meaning other than what's given to them by the reader. But in reality, the sacred texts of any religion are not infinitely malleable. You can't take slay the unbelievers wherever you find them and transform it into love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. You can't legitimately say that slay the unbelievers means love your enemies if only you could read the original Arabic. You can't legitimately say that slay the unbelievers means love your enemies if you really understood the context. For the believer, the actual words of the Quran are generally not all that difficult to understand, as hard as they may be to put them into practice. Finally, there are those who argue that the Quran's violent commandments are largely meaningless since similar ones are found in the Bible. And so they say, well, see, every religion has its exhortations to violence. Not every religion takes them seriously, and Muslims take them seriously and don't take them seriously in just the same proportion that Christians and Jews take the violent passages of the Old Testament seriously. And so you find extremists in all religions, and it doesn't really matter. You can't blame the religion itself for the actions of the believers. Now, this is a lazy moral equivalency that actually overlooks the glaring and obvious fact, the obvious fact to anybody who's honest, that there's hardly a single organization today, not a single one around the world, that commits violent acts and justifies them by quoting the Bible and invoking Judaism or Christianity. The mainstream media frequently warns us about the danger of Christian extremism or even Christian terrorism, citing examples like Timothy McVeigh, who blew up the government building in Oklahoma City in 1995. And he was, in fact, agnostic at the time and never quoted any scriptures to justify what he was doing. Then there are, of course, the abortion clinic bombers, such as Scott Roeder, the alleged killer of late-term abortionist George Tiller. Now, such examples in the first place are extremely rare. There is a handful of abortion clinic bombings and shooting of abortionists compared to the nearly 20,000 jihad attacks carried out around the world since 9/11, each one of them with the imprimatur of a Muslim cleric and with quotations of the Quran ready to hand by those who were committing them. There are nearly daily attacks by Islamic jihadis throughout the world. They're so common, in fact, that the mainstream press only bothers to report them on occasion nowadays if there's a particularly egregious attack or one with a large number of casualties. What's more, the killing of the abortionist Tiller and the bombings of abortion clinics have been condemned by Catholic and Protestant churches, by every major pro-life group. This is not surprising, of course, since there is no school of Christian thought or sect of Christianity that justifies terrorism or the killing of anyone on the basis of biblical texts. In contrast, Islamic jihadis around the world point to the Quran to explain what they're doing and why, and to heap contempt upon those Muslims who deny the Quran's martial contents. As a matter of fact, just recently, there was a statement from an Islamic group that said that liberal Muslims are essentially heretics and apostates and should be killed. That Muslims who do not understand that every bit of the Quran is applicable in our age are departing from its true teachings and thus liable to the Quran and Islam's death penalty for people who reject various portions of its teachings. Now, this is a difficulty for Muslims who would rather not carry out the violent passages of the Quran in their lives, or who even deny that they exist, or would just prefer to live as if they weren't there. They're always under pressure from jihadis and from jihad groups Jihadis and jihad groups and Islamic supremacist groups around the world portray themselves as the exponents of true and authentic Islam. They do this within Muslim communities. And when they do so, the Muslims who do not live according to the violent and supremacist teachings of the Quran, and who do not think that it is something that they're interested in doing, that is waging war against unbelievers and working toward their subjugation, they're put on the defensive. It isn't as if they have another understanding of the Quran that sees the passages that we're going to be examining in this series in a different light. It isn't as if they have a view of the Quran that comes from a different school of thought or different tradition and does not mandate warfare against unbelievers. There is no such understanding of the Quran in Islam. There is no mainstream sect or school of jurisprudence of Islam that does not teach warfare against unbelievers and the necessity to subjugate those unbelievers as inferiors under the rule of Islamic law. This is mainstream Islam, and it comes from, ultimately, the Quran. Now, this is something that, of course, is extremely controversial and widely misunderstood. You can take, for example, Barack Obama in his address in Cairo in 2009, June 4th, 2009. Obama spoke at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, the most prestigious institution in the world of Sunni Islam. And he was making an appeal to the Islamic world to live in peace and harmony with the West. In doing so, he expressed his tremendous admiration for Islam and the Quran. The Holy Quran, said Obama, teaches that whoever kills an innocent, it is as if he has killed all mankind. And whoever saves a person, it is as if he has saved all mankind. Now, Obama, in quoting that, was quoting chapter 5, verse 32 of the Quran, which actually couches that warning about killing an innocent person as saying that Allah actually told that to the Jews, that he warned the Jews that if they killed an innocent person, it would be as if they had killed all mankind. And so they should not do so. It is interesting to note that this passage also is one that is taken from the Talmud, in which it is said straightforwardly that whoever kills an innocent person, it is as if he has killed all mankind. But the Talmud does not follow up with what follows this in the Quran. Obama did not quote chapter 5, verse 33 of the Quran, which goes on to say that those who wage war against Allah and his messenger should be punished by either being crucified or having their hands and feet cut off, hand and foot cut off on opposite sides. Now, the axiom against killing innocents came from the Jewish tradition, but in the Quranic passage it becomes something very different. It becomes a warning of dire earthly punishments for the Jews who reject Muhammad and resist the spread of Islam. Yet Obama only quoted one piece of it, the piece that gave the impression that this was a passage enjoining peace. It's also interesting to note that Obama quoted another passage, chapter 9, verse 119. He said, as the Holy Quran tells us, be conscious of God and speak always the truth. And then Obama went on to say, that is what I will try to do, to speak the truth as best I can, humbled by the task before us, and firm in my belief that the interests we share as human beings are far more powerful than the forces that drive us apart. Now, once again, this Quranic passage is actually about fighting unbelievers. It doesn't remotely advocate peaceful coexistence. One principal English translation of that passage renders it this way: O ye who believe, be careful of your duty to Allah, and be with the truthful. And it goes on to say, it is not for the townsfolk of Medina and for those around them of the wandering Arabs to stay behind the messenger of Allah and prefer their lives to his life. In other words, they should not make him go out and lead battle against the unbelievers. They should be leading battle against the unbelievers. That is because neither thirst nor toil nor hunger afflicts them in the way of Allah, nor step they any step that angers the disbelievers, nor gain they from the enemy a gain, but a good deed is recorded for them therefore. In other words, if they anger the disbelievers, and if they gain against them, then they will be rewarded by Allah. Lo, it goes on, Allah does not lose the wages of the good,
nor spend they any spending, nor do they spend anything, small or great, nor do they cross a valley, but it is recorded for them, that Allah may repay them the best of what they used to do. And the believers should not all go out to fight. Of every troop of them, a party only should go forth, that they who are left behind may gain sound knowledge in religion, and that they may warn their folk when they return, so that they may beware. O you who believe, fight those of the disbelievers who are near to you, and let them find harshness in you. And know that Allah is with those who keep their duty, that is their duty to fight. And so as Allah said, be conscious of God and speak always the truth. Conscious of God and speaking always the truth. We're going to, over the next few weeks, explore the teachings of the Quran. We're going to explore them fully and honestly. And by the end of this series, I trust that you will understand why it is that a woman like Ra'im Raishi would be able to brandish the Quran in one hand and the rifle in another, and ultimately to explode a bomb and to kill herself in an attempt to murder several non-Muslims. And that many, many jihadis around the world brandish the Quran. Thank you. I'm Robert Spencer. We'll be back with more in the next episode.